Imagine you are a Roman legionary.
Okay.
It's the early 170s AD. You're trapped in this sweltering, totally unfamiliar valley somewhere deep in Central Europe, far beyond the comforting borders of the empire.
Right. Way out of your element.
Exactly. You are completely surrounded by a massive coalition of hostile warriors, people who know the terrain way better than you do. The sun is just beating down relentlessly. You haven't had a drop of water in days.
It's just a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, your tongue is literally swelling in your mouth. You're looking around at your fellow soldiers, the supposedly invincible war machine of Rome.
Right.
And you realize you aren't going to die in some glorious battle. You're going to die of thirst in the mud.
Wow.
And then suddenly the sky explodes.
Yeah, it is one of the most cinematic, really terrifying, and profoundly consequential moments in the ancient world.
It really is.
It's a moment of just total existential despair, followed by an event so seemingly inexplicable that it completely rewired the narrative of the Roman Empire.
Right. Well, welcome to a brand new deep dive, everyone. Today, we are unpacking a historical mystery that has honestly baffled scholars for nearly 2 millennia.
It's a huge topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
We are talking about the reign of the philosopher king, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the brutal realities of the Marcomannic Wars, and an event famously known as the Rain and Lightning Miracles. But this isn't just a military history.
No, not at all. It's really a story about, well, the machinery of history itself.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be diving into the brilliant, really comprehensive work of historian Peter Kovacs. He's done this incredible synthesis of literary texts, numismatic evidence, which, is the study of coins, and monumental archaeology.
Right, looking at everything at once.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what he reveals is how an empire, when pushed to the absolute brink of collapse, will take a genuine physical event and just warp it.
Or warp it through the lenses of propaganda and religion, right?
Yeah, and outright forgery, too.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this. What happens when the physical monuments of an empire like these massive marble columns standing right in the center of Rome completely contradict the official written scrolls?
It's a fascinating problem.
We are going to become historical detectives today to find out.
It's a phenomenal puzzle, really. But to really grasp why this miracle became such a heavily contested piece of propaganda, we have to kind of connect this to the bigger picture first.
Right. Set the stage.
Yeah. We first have to understand the sheer, unadulterated desperation of the Roman Empire at this exact moment in time. The rain and lightning miracles weren't just interesting weather anomalies.
They meant something more.
Exactly. They were psychological necessities. They were born from a society experiencing total existential dread.
Existential dread is definitely the right phrase. Let's talk about the situation on the ground, because usually when we hear about this period, people just toss around the term the Marcomannic Wars.
Right.
But Kovacs makes it very clear that this term is actually a massive historical misnomer, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the Romans called it the Marcomannic War, which is why the label stuck. But that implies they were just fighting one specific tribe, the Marcomanni.
Like it's just some localized border dispute or something.
Yeah, and that could not be further from the truth. If you look at the scale, this was an unprecedented, multi-front, catastrophic conflict. They were fighting against this vast coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes.
Wow.
You have the Marcomanni, yes, but also the Quadi, the Cotini, the Iziges, the Vandals, the Lombards.
It's like everyone all at once.
Exactly. It was as if the entire northern frontier suddenly linked arms and slammed into the Roman defenses at the exact same time.
Which raises the question, why then? I mean, why did all these disparate tribes who usually fought each other just as much as they fought Rome suddenly form this mega coalition?
That is the million-dollar question for this era. Historians generally believe it was sort of a domino effect.
Oh, like one group pushing another.
Right. There were massive population migrations happening much further north and east. This was possibly due to climate shifts or other tribal pressures. We don't know for sure.
Okay.
But those distant tribes pushed into the Marcomanni and the Quadi, who lived right on Rome's doorstep along the Danube River.
Ah, so they're getting squeezed.
Exactly. So these border tribes essentially had a choice: get crushed by the people migrating behind them or push forward into the wealthy, seemingly stable Roman Empire. They chose the latter.
I mean, it makes sense from their perspective. And the timeline of this massive collision is generally broken down into 2 massive chunks, right?
Yes.
You have the First Marcomannic War, which runs roughly from 166 to 175 AD, and then the Second Marcomannic War from 178 to 180 AD.
Correct. But the dates alone don't really capture the sheer panic in Rome. To understand the Roman mindset, you have to understand a very specific Latin phrase from the time.
Okay, what is it?
Timor belli Marcomannici.
Timor belli Marcomannici.
Yeah, the fear of the Marcomannic War. This wasn't your standard, political fretting over some distant campaign in Gaul or Britain. This was a deep, visceral, societal panic.
Because the borders didn't hold.
Exactly. For centuries, Rome had fought its wars on other people's land. But the Marcomannic coalition didn't just attack the border forts on the Danube. They obliterated them.
Wow.
They broke through the Alpine passes and invaded Italy itself.
That is just wild.
Yeah, they burned down the city of Opiturgium. They laid siege to Aquileia. And Aquileia wasn't some minor outpost. It was a major, wealthy, crucial Roman economic hub right at the top of the Adriatic Sea.
I was actually trying to come up with a modern analogy for this to help you, the listener, picture this.
Yeah, what did you think of?
It's like a modern superpower,
Mhm.
say the United States, that has spent the last century fighting all of its conflicts as, away games on foreign soil.
Right, right.
Suddenly, out of nowhere, an enemy coalition breaches the physical borders and lays a brutal siege to Chicago or Seattle.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. The psychological shock to the average Roman citizen must have been absolutely staggering. The myth of an untouchable Rome, an empire shielded by impenetrable frontiers and invincible legions, it just evaporated overnight. Did this collective trauma set the stage for people needing to believe in divine intervention?
Oh, absolutely. That is precisely the psychological landscape you have to keep in mind. Rome was suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable. And their response really reflects that desperation.
What did they do?
Well, to stop this invasion of Italy, they had to establish something called the Praetentura Italiae et Alpium.
Okay, for those of us who don't speak Latin, what exactly is the Praetentura?
It translates roughly to the defense of Italy and the Alps. But in practice, it was this emergency ad hoc military zone. They were basically trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship.
Right.
The Roman military was stretched so incredibly thin that they were scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel for manpower. They were pulling police forces from cities, enlisting slaves, recruiting gladiators.
Wait. They were arming slaves and gladiators.
Yes.
The very people who famously revolted under Spartacus a few centuries earlier.
Exactly. Anyone who could hold a spear was thrown into the Alps to stop these tribes from marching on Rome itself.
That alone tells you how desperate the Senate and the emperor must have been. I mean, they were willing to risk an internal uprising because the external threat was that apocalyptic.
Great.
And the reason they had no manpower leads us to the other horseman of the apocalypse riding through Rome at this exact moment, which is the Antonine Plague.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is how multiple catastrophic crises converge to create a perfect storm.
Yeah.
At the exact same time the northern borders were collapsing, the empire was being ravaged by one of the deadliest pandemics in ancient history.
Where did it come from?
Earlier in the 160s, Marcus Aurelius' co-emperor, Lucius Verus, had been commanding a massive, largely successful war against the Parthian Empire in the east.
So modern day on Iraq and Iran area?
No? Yes. But when those victorious Roman legions marched back west to return home, they brought a microscopic enemy with them. We don't know exactly what it was. Scholars still debate whether it was smallpox or a strain of measles, maybe.
Okay.
But whatever it was, the Antonine Plague was devastating.
I was reading through the source notes on the plague, and the numbers are just hard to process. We are talking about mortality rates that emptied out entire cities. The historian Cassius Dio claimed that at its peak, the plague was killing 2,000 people a day in Rome alone.
Yeah, the demographic collapse was truly unprecedented. It crippled the Roman economy because there just weren't enough people to farm the land or pay taxes.
Right.
And crucially, it decimated the military ranks. The legions were completely hollowed out by disease, which directly led to the vulnerabilities that allowed the Marcomanni and Quadi to break through the borders in the first place.
So it's all connected.
Very much so. This sheer, desperate reliance on the military to hold a collapsing state together, it really foreshadowed the era of the soldier emperors that would tear the empire apart in the 3rd century.
And just when you think the situation cannot possibly get worse for Rome, the leadership fractures. In 169 AD, the co-emperor Lucius Verus suddenly dies.
Likely from the very plague his troops brought back.
Oh, wow.
Which leaves Marcus Aurelius entirely alone. He has to shoulder the burden of a dying, bleeding empire by himself.
And this is the great irony of Marcus Aurelius, isn't it? He is remembered today as the ultimate philosopher king. He studied Stoicism. His dream was to sit in a villa and contemplate the nature of virtue and the cosmos.
Like he was an intellectual.
He didn't have the extensive, aggressive military background of an emperor like Trajan, for instance. Yet, by the cruelest twist of fate, this peaceful philosopher is forced to spend the final 13 years of his life on the brutal, freezing front lines in Pannonia, so modern-day Hungary and Austria.
Living out of military camps. It is a remarkable historical contradiction.
Yeah.
He's out there managing logistics, overseeing these brutal, punitive campaigns, trying to negotiate with tribal warlords by day, and by night, he is retreating to his tent to write the Meditations.
Which is basically his private philosophical diary.
Right, about how to maintain inner peace in a world of total chaos.
Writing about emotional detachment while literally surrounded by the mud, the blood, and the freezing rain of the Danubian frontier, it's just such a stark image. The philosopher, forced to become a butcher just to keep the world from ending.
Yeah, and this brings us perfectly back to the incident we opened with. Because you cannot understand the rain and lightning miracles without understanding this context.
The desperation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Romans aren't just fighting a battle. They are fighting for the survival of their civilization. They're exhausted by plague, commanded by a philosopher out of his depth, and deeply traumatized by the invasion of their homeland.
Okay, so let's zoom in. From the grand, sweeping geopolitics of a collapsing empire to a very specific, terrifying moment in the dirt. We're in the First Marcomannic War. We're in the territory of the Quadi, likely somewhere in the dense forests of modern-day Slovakia or the Czech Republic. The Roman troops have overextended, they've been cut off, outmaneuvered, and are completely surrounded by the enemy.
Now, the sources refer to this event collectively as a miracle. But what Peter Kovacs points out in his analysis is that the ancient texts often fuse things together. They confuse the timeline and the actual mechanics of the event.
Okay.
Based on a rigorous cross-examination of the physical evidence, which we will analyze shortly, there were actually two distinct, separate, miraculous events.
Right. It wasn't just one big, convenient thunderstorm that solved all their problems at once.
No, it wasn't. First, there was the lightning miracle. The Quadi had the Romans pinned down, and they had constructed this massive siege engine, referred to in the texts as a machinamentum.
Okay.
This tower was threatening to break the Roman defensive position entirely.
Which is terrifying. I mean, a machinamentum isn't just a ladder. It's a massive multi-story wooden structure covered in animal hides to prevent burning, filled with enemy soldiers shooting down into your ranks. If that thing reaches your lines, the battle is over.
Exactly. The Romans are bracing for the end, and suddenly, from a clear sky or a sudden squall, this massive lightning strike blasts down and completely vaporizes the enemy siege engine.
Wow.
It shatters the machinamentum, killing the warriors inside and halting the immediate assault.
A literal bolt from the blue. But the lightning only solves the immediate tactical problem of the siege tower, right? It doesn't solve the biological problem. Which brings us to the second, more famous event, the rain miracle.
This happens later. The Romans are still trapped. The heat is unbearable. They have no access to rivers or wells. They are quite literally dying of dehydration.
Oh, man.
In ancient warfare, thirst kills faster than swords. The Quadis don't even need to attack, really. They just need to wait for the Romans to collapse.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to make sure you listening can visualize this. The Roman troops, in a desperate bid to protect themselves from arrows while they slowly dehydrate, they form up into their testudo formations.
The famous formation.
Yeah, for those who might not know Roman military tactics, a testudo is the tortoise. The soldiers pack tightly together and hold their large rectangular shield interlocked over their heads, creating a solid roof of wood and leather to deflect projectiles.
It is a purely defensive posture. They are just hunkered down, waiting for the end.
But then the sky darkens. A torrential, violent rainstorm bursts directly over the Roman position, and these soldiers, still holding their shields up, realize what is happening. They start tipping their heads back, drinking the rain directly from the sky.
Unbelievable.
They use their curved shields as makeshift rainwater catchment systems, funneling the water into their helmets. They are literally drinking the storm to survive.
But the miracle isn't just the water, it's the highly localized violence of the storm.
What do you mean?
Well, while the rain is reviving the Romans The very same storm is dropping fatal lightning and massive lethal hail down upon the Quadi forces surrounding them. The
Wow.
barbarians are being electrocuted and battered, their horses are panicking, and flash floods are literally washing away their camps. The storm revitalizes Rome and simultaneously crushes the enemy.
It is incredibly cinematic.
Yeah.
Revived by water, the Romans break out of their defensive shells, counterattack the panicked Quadi, and seize an impossible victory from the jaws of certain death.
Yeah.
But here's the crucial detail that Kovacs highlights, and it is the linchpin for everything that follows. Emperor Marcus Aurelius was physically present on the battlefield for the first event, the lightning miracle. But he was absent for the second event, the rain miracle.
That is a vital distinction.
Really?
Because the moment the storm clears, the moment these exhausted, mud-soaked soldiers realize they are actually going to live, a massive war of words erupts.
The real war begins.
Right. The physical battle in the valley is over, but the propaganda battle in Rome is just beginning.
Because surviving a miracle isn't enough in politics. Someone has to claim ownership of it.
Exactly. Who gets the credit? Whose God saved the empire? This brings us to the most complex part of the source material.
Now, before we dive into these competing claims, we need to pause and make a very clear statement to you, the listener. The ancient historical texts we are about to discuss contain deeply conflicting religious propaganda.
Yes, very polarized.
We have early Christian claims on one side and entrenched pagan Roman claims on the other. We, as your hosts, are absolutely not taking sides here.
Right.
We are not endorsing either viewpoint as the ultimate spiritual truth, nor are we validating one religion over the other. Our goal in this deep dive is to impartially report on the ideas contained in the original source material.
Exactly. We just want to understand how history was recorded.
How it was manipulated by various factions and how different groups tried to claim ownership of a verifiable meteorological event to push their own agendas.
Well said. We like to say history is written by the victors, but in the case of the rain miracle, history was written by anyone with a quill, an audience, and a theological agenda. Let's look at the Christian claim first, because it became incredibly prominent in later centuries.
Right. Early Christian authors really latched onto this event. We are talking about writers like Claudius Apollinaris, Tertullian, and later the famous historian Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history. They vehemently claimed that this miraculous storm was explicitly caused by the prayers of Christian soldiers serving in the Roman army.
Specifically, they point to a unit called the Legio XII Fulminata.
The Thundering Legion.
Yes. According to the Christian narrative, when the army was on the brink of death by dehydration, the pagan gods did nothing. But the Christian soldiers within the Legio XII stepped forward, fell to their knees in the mud, and prayed directly to their god.
And then the rain comes.
Instantly. The heavens opened, the rain fell, and the lightning struck the enemy. Tertullian goes so far as to claim that Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself recognized this. Yeah, he claims Marcus wrote an official letter to the Roman Senate acknowledging that the prayers of the Christians saved the army, and as a result, the emperor demanded that the official state persecution of Christians be halted immediately.
Which, if true, would be a massive turning point in the history of the early church. But the pagans, who actually ran the empire at this time, had a completely different spin on the event.
Completely different. The pagan intellectual elite could not allow a minority persecuted sect to claim credit for saving the Roman army. So they offer their own explanation.
What were they saying?
Well, Cassius Dio, who is a prominent Roman historian and a senator, wrote that the rain was brought about by an Egyptian magician named Arnuphis.
Wait, an Egyptian magician? Hang on, let me push back on this because it makes zero sense based on what we just discussed about Marcus Aurelius.
How so?
Marcus was a famously strict, rational, stoic philosopher. Are we really supposed to believe that he kept a traveling Egyptian sorcerer on his elite military staff right next to his generals to do weather magic? That sounds incredibly out of character.
It does sound absurd to a modern ear, and even to some ancient ones, but in the intellectual climate of the 2nd century, the lines between philosophy, religion, and magic were often, blurred.
Ah, okay.
Cassius Dio claims that Arnuphis invoked Hermes Arios, the Greek god of the air, along with other deities, using specific magical incantations to summon the rain.
I see.
For a Roman senator like Dio, crediting an exotic Egyptian mystic invoking traditional pagan gods was far more acceptable than crediting the Christians.
Okay, but Arnuphis wasn't the only pagan explanation, right? It seems like everyone was throwing theories at the wall to see what stuck.
Oh, there are many others. Later pagan traditions, which were compiled centuries later in the Byzantine era by an encyclopedia known as the Suda, claimed the miracle was actually the work of a man named Julian the Theurgist.
Okay, what is a theurgist?
Theurgy is essentially God working. It's a form of high magic, where the practitioner attempts to invoke the presence of one or more gods with the goal of achieving union with the divine, or in this case, manipulating the weather. And Julian was a Chaldean, meaning he came from the region of Mesopotamia, an area the Romans associated with ancient, powerful mysticism. So again, they are crediting an exotic mystic.
But my favorite pagan explanation is the one that just skips the middleman entirely.
Yeah, it has Sibylline oracles.
Exactly. You find it in a collection of texts called the Oracula Sibyllina, or the Sibylline Oracles. These were collections of prophetic utterances that were incredibly popular in antiquity. And their version of the story claims that Marcus Aurelius himself, being a pious, dutiful, and deeply philosophical emperor, simply stretched out his hands to the sky, prayed to Jupiter, the king of the gods, and Jupiter answered him directly.
It is the ultimate piece of imperial propaganda. It says, we don't need magicians, and we certainly don't need Christians. Our emperor is so virtuous that the gods listen to him directly.
So we have Christian soldiers praying in the mud, an Egyptian magician casting spells to Hermes, a Chaldean sorcerer working high magic, and the emperor himself having a direct hotline to Jupiter.
Yeah, quite the mix.
Everyone is trying to take the credit, but let's look closer at the actual written records that survive. Because you and I were going over Kovacs's analysis of these texts, and they are riddled with massive problems.
You really are.
Let's start with Cassius Dio, the guy who blamed the Egyptian magician. You mentioned that his account is highly suspect.
Well, the core problem with Cassius Dio is that we do not have his complete original manuscript for this specific period of Roman history. What we have is an epitome.
Explain what an epitome is for us.
Imagine someone took a massive multi-volume history book and decided to write a Cliff's Notes summary of it. That summary is an epitome.
Okay.
The version of Cassius Dio we rely on for the Marcomannic Wars was written centuries later, in the 11th century, by a Byzantine monk named Xiphalaenus. He was reading Dio's original work and summarizing it for a medieval audience.
And as anyone who has ever played a game of telephone knows, summarizing complex information often leads to massive errors.
It's exactly. Kovacs argues that Xiphalaenus completely mangled the timeline of the miracles. When Xiphalaenus summarized the events, he explicitly linked the story of the miracles to the moment Marcus Aurelius received his 7th imperial acclamation.
What's an imperial acclamation?
Is a formal title and honor bestowed upon an emperor by his troops following a major military victory. We know from solid, independent Roman records that Marcus received his 7th acclamation in the year 174 AD.
Ah, I see where this is going. So Xiphalaenus, summarizing a book centuries later, sees a big victory, sees a miracle, and just squishes them together into the year 174 AD.
Yes, he confused the timeline by fusing the two distinct miracles together and pinning them to 174 AD, when in reality the military campaigns and the physical evidence suggest these events happened much earlier in the war.
Wow.
But the textual confusion doesn't stop with the Byzantine monk's bad summary. We also have to deal with the outright forgeries.
Oh, this is easily my favorite part of the source material. It is the deep fake of antiquity.
It really is.
So, attached to the 14th century manuscripts of a famous Christian apologist named Justin Martyr, historians found a letter written in Greek. This letter is allegedly written by Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself, addressed directly to the Roman Senate, describing the rain miracle in detail and giving 100% of the credit to the Christian soldiers.
And let's be clear, modern historians unanimously agree that this letter is a complete, undeniable forgery. It was likely manufactured by a Christian writer in the early 4th century, long after Marcus Aurelius was dead.
And this is what's so fascinating about how historical manipulation works. It's a really good forgery in certain aspects.
Yeah, it has some clever details.
I compare it to a modern deepfake video. If someone makes a deepfake of a politician to make them say something scandalous, and they put the politician in a purple clown suit, your brain immediately knows it's fake.
Yeah.
But if they take the time to put the politician in the exact blue tie they wore on Tuesday, standing behind the exact podium they always use, in a room with the correct lighting, your brain is tricked into believing the audio. The superficial details sell the lie. And that is exactly what this 4th century forger did.
That's a perfect analogy. The author of this fake letter didn't just invent a fantasy scenario in a void. They included startlingly accurate military and topographic details to make the lie convincing.
Like what?
For example, the forged letter correctly places the battle in the specific territory of the Cotini tribe. It mentions specific realistic marching distances. It accurately lists the exact legions that we know were actually present in that sector, like the Legio Iudetrix and the Legio Ex Gemina.
It's the blue tie of the ancient world. The forger used real, verifiable military data to trick the reader.
Exactly.
But here is the massive red flag, the kicker that gives the whole game away. The forged letter completely omits the Legio 12 Fulminata.
Which is astonishing. The Legio XII is the very legion that other Christian authors, like Tertullian and Eusebius, built their entire theological narrative around.
So why leave them out?
Well, Kovacs points out that this omission actually tells us something profound. It suggests that the author of this forgery wasn't just making things up. They might have actually been relying on authentic, original military reports from the imperial archives.
Oh, wow.
They might have been looking at an earlier draft of a real letter from Marcus Aurelius before deciding to embellish the theological aspects. The inclusion of accurate topography and real legions, while forgetting to include the mythical Christian legion, suggests the forger was working from genuine historical data.
Which raises an obvious question. If Marcus Aurelius actually wrote a real letter to the Senate about this event, which he almost certainly did because emperors had to send official military dispatches back to Rome, what would the real letter have actually said?
We obviously don't have the original, but Kovacs suggests that the authentic letter likely described the desperate tactical situation, the sudden saving rainstorm, and the subsequent victory, but attributed the event to a generic, abstract deity.
Which perfectly aligns with his philosophy. If you read his Meditations, Marcus Aurelius frequently refers to the divine or providence or simply God in a very broad, inclusive, stoic sense.
Right, he was not a religious fundamentalist.
He certainly wouldn't have specified the Christian God in an official state document, nor would he likely have credited an obscure Egyptian magician to the Roman Senate.
Exactly. By attributing the miracle to a generic, abstract, divine intervention, Marcus unintentionally allowed a massive ideological vacuum to form.
And nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. Both the Christians and the pagans rushed in to project their own specific beliefs onto that ambiguous divine language.
Yeah.
The Christians pointed and said, see, he means it was our prayers. The pagans pointed and said, no, he clearly means it was Jupiter, or, it was Hermes.
Precisely. The written texts from this era are incredibly biased, layered with centuries of translation errors, bad summaries by monks, and outright ideological forgeries. If we only had the texts, we would never know the truth.
So if the parchment scrolls are lying to us, where do we turn? If the texts are heavily manipulated by religious factions, we can't trust the ink.
No, we can't.
We have to look at what they carved into stone. We turn our attention away from the libraries and into the heart of Rome itself to examine the monumental physical evidence left behind.
Yeah, we are talking about the Columna Centenaria, the column of Marcus Aurelius. This is an astonishing piece of archaeological evidence, and it still stands in Rome today.
Let's give the listener a sense of scale. What are we looking at here?
It is a massive triumphal column, standing exactly 100 Roman feet tall. Technically, architecturally, it is known as a columna cocculus, meaning it has a spiral staircase hidden inside the hollow center of the marble blocks, allowing someone to walk all the way to the top.
That's incredible.
But the exterior is what matters for our detective work. The outside of the column features 116 intricately carved scenes that wind 21 times in a continuous rising spiral from the base all the way to the top, which originally held a massive bronze statue of Marcus Aurelius himself.
It is an absolute marvel of engineering and art. It's essentially an ancient comic book, a visual narrative of the Marcomannic Wars carved in marble.
Great way to describe it.
But Kovacs spends a significant amount of his book analyzing the style of these carvings, because visually, emotionally, it is vastly different from previous Roman monuments.
Yes, Kovacs introduces the concept of the late Antonine Baroque style. To understand why this matters, you have to compare it to the most famous column in Rome, Trajan's column, which was built a few decades earlier to celebrate the conquest of Dacia.
Right.
The art on Trajan's column is very classical, very measured, very Greek in its inspiration. It portrays the Dacian enemy as noble, worthy adversaries.
Right, almost respectful.
Yeah, the combat is traditional, almost sporting. The Roman soldiers are clean, efficient, and heroic. It's a sanitized, idealized version of war.
But Marcus's column is completely different. When I look at the reliefs on Marcus's column, I compare it to a modern movie franchise that suddenly gets a dark, gritty, R-rated reboot.
Oh, absolutely.
It is grim, it is visceral, it is deeply violent. It doesn't focus on glorious open-field battles or heroic single combat. Instead, it highlights the absolute brutal destruction of the enemy.
Yeah, it's very graphic.
You see barbarian villages being burned to the ground. You see mass executions with swords to the neck. You see the forced, violent relocation of barbarian women and children crying as they are dragged away from their homes. The Romans on this column don't just defeat the enemy, they annihilate them with extreme prejudice.
This raises an incredibly important question for historians. Why the shift? Why did Roman art suddenly become so brutal?
Right, why the change in tone?
The art reflects the psychology of the time. The visual message is that the Romans were punishing the superbia, the pride and arrogance of the barbarians.
And doesn't this tie directly back to the Timur belli Marco Medici we talked about at the very beginning? The deep societal terror of having Italy invaded.
I think so, yes.
I look at this column and I wonder, did the Roman public, who had just been deeply traumatized by the threat of barbarians sacking their cities, literally need to see brutal revenge carved into stone to feel safe again?
I think that is exactly the psychological mechanism at play. The column isn't just a historical record, it is a monumental piece of psychological reassurance for a terrified populace.
Yeah.
The government is using art to say, yes, they broke through our borders, yes, it was terrifying, but look at what we are doing to them in return.
Yeah.
Look at the fire and the sword. They will never, ever threaten us again.
Okay, so within this dark, gritty, vengeful comic book carved in stone, let's look at how the rain and lightning miracles are depicted, because the stones don't lie the way the scrolls do.
The visual narrative on the column separates the two miraculous events clearly, proving they did not happen at the same time. If you follow the spiral up, scene 11 shows the lightning miracle.
Scene 11, okay.
It clearly depicts a massive wooden siege engine, the Machinamentum, being struck and destroyed by a bolt of lightning. And importantly, the figure of Emperor Marcus Aurelius is carved directly into the scene, physically present, receiving the omen from the sky.
All right, so Marcus is there for the lightning, and then we wind our way further up the spiral to scene the sea.
Scene 16 shows the rain miracle. And this is where the visual, physical evidence completely undercuts both the Christian and the pagan written claims we discussed earlier.
How so?
Well, the relief carving does not show a group of Christian soldiers on their knees praying. It does not show an Egyptian magician waving a wand. It does not even show Marcus Aurelius praying to Jupiter.
What does it show?
It features a massive, imposing, terrifying, winged and bearded figure. But it's not a traditional Roman god. It is a figure made entirely of water and swirling clouds, an allegorical rain god.
Oh, interesting.
Water is physically pouring from his massive arms and outstretched wings. Beneath him, the Roman soldiers are looking up and drinking the water, while the barbarians and their horses are being violently washed away and drowned in a flash flood.
A winged rain god. Not Jupiter, not Hermes, not the Christian god. Just an allegorical representation of raw, destructive nature. And as we noted earlier, Marcus Aurelius is nowhere to be seen in this specific panel.
Exactly. The artist used a generic allegory because attributing the miracle to a specific deity was politically or religiously fraught, or perhaps because the official state line, as we speculated with the original letter, was simply that the divine intervened.
It's a visual compromise.
Right, it sidesteps the intense propaganda war happening in the texts.
But the miracles aren't the only clues carved into this column. There are other fascinating structural details that Kovacs uses to solve the timeline, right? Like the figure of Victoria.
Yes. About halfway up the 100-foot column, separating the lower spirals from the upper spirals, there is a distinct carving of the goddess Victoria. She's depicted riding on a shield.
Why is that important?
In Roman monumental art, this specific motif isn't just decorative. It heavily implies a chronological break. It divides the 116 scenes into two distinct military campaigns, or two distinct phases of the war.
And then there are the missing people. We know from the written history that Lucius Verus was the co-emperor at the very start of the Marcomannic Wars, and we know that Commodus, Marcus's son, was there at the very end of the wars, but neither of them appears on the main narrative spiral of the column.
Which is a massive, glaring clue for dating the events. Because Lucius Verus died in 169 AD, his total absence implies the column must depict events that occurred after his death.
Makes sense.
Conversely, Commodus became heavily involved in the military campaigns later on, so his absence suggests the column does not cover the very end of the Second War. This fuels a massive, ongoing debate among historians about exactly which years those 116 carved scenes actually represent.
Which brings us to the grand finale of this detective story. We have the deeply biased, manipulated texts. We have the 100-foot marble column with its gritty artwork and missing emperors. We have the broader, terrifying history of a plague-ridden empire fighting for its life. How does Peter Kovacs pull all these disparate threads together to finally solve the chronology and pinpoint when the miracles actually happened?
He has to step outside the immediate narrative and look at alternative sources of hard, irrefutable data. First, he looks at numismatic evidence, the coins.
What do the coins tell us?
During the years 172 and 173 AD, the Roman mint produced a very specific series of coins depicting the god Hermes, or Mercury. Now, earlier historians looked at these coins and got incredibly excited. They said, aha, look at the text. Cassius Dio claimed the Egyptian magician Arnufis invoked Hermes to cause the rain miracle. And here are coins with Hermes from 172 AD. Therefore, the coins prove the miracle happened right around then, and the Arnufis story must be the true, official state version.
It sounds like a solid deduction on the surface. But Kovacs pushes back on that conclusion, right?
He does, and quite forcefully. Kovacs and other modern scholars argue that you have to look at Marcus Aurelius the philosopher, not just Marcus the general. Marcus had a long-standing, deep personal and philosophical interest in the figure of Hermes Trismegistus.
Oh, I see. So minting coins with Hermes wasn't necessarily a grand state endorsement of a barbarian-slaying weather miracle brought on by a random Egyptian sorcerer. It was likely just part of the emperor's standard, ongoing religious and philosophical propaganda.
The coins are a red herring.
Exactly. They are a coincidence of timing, not proof of the magician's story.
Right.
So if the coins are a dead end for dating the miracle, what else do we have? We have epigraphic evidence, inscriptions carved into stone. Now we are getting into the real hard data. Tell us about the Adrastus inscription.
We have a surviving inscription from a man named Adrastus. He was a freedman, a former slave, who served as the procurator of the column of Marcus Aurelius.
What does a procurator do?
In this context, he was basically the official manager, caretaker, and guardian of the monument. He was responsible for its upkeep. The inscription we have from Adrastus dates precisely to the year 193 AD.
Okay.
In it, he is formally asking the city government for permission to build a small house or guard shack near the base of the column so he can live there and protect it from vandalism.
That is such a fascinatingly mundane detail. A guy just asking for a permit to build a shed. But why is it so important historically?
Because it proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the column was completely finished, erected, and in need of a full-time guard by 193 AD. This is well after Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD. It gives us a hard, immovable anchor point for when the physical monument was finalized.
And speaking of 180 AD, that is a deeply pivotal year that changes the entire course of Roman history. Marcus Aurelius, exhausted, worn down by 13 years of continuous warfare in the freezing mud, finally dies of an illness in his military camp in Pannonia. His young son, Commodus, immediately takes over as emperor.
Yes.
And what does Commodus do? He abruptly signs a peace treaty with the Quadi and the Marcomanni, packs up the entire Roman army, and marches back to the comforts of Rome, effectively ending the war overnight.
This is a crucial point for Kovacs's broader synthesis of the era. History and pop culture, frankly, like the famous Ridley Scott movie Gladiator, has judged Commodus incredibly harshly for this specific decision.
Definitely.
He is traditionally portrayed as a weak, hedonistic coward who selfishly abandoned his father's noble crusade to conquer and civilize the barbarian North.
But I want to challenge that traditional narrative, because when you look at the facts we've just laid out, it doesn't hold up.
Yeah.
Was Marcus Aurelius really on a glorious crusade of conquest? Or was Commodus actually making a highly rational, pragmatic decision to end an unwinnable, grueling, decades-long quagmire?
That's the real question.
Right. The Roman legions had been fighting in the freezing mud for over 10 years. The empire's economy was completely wrecked by the Antonine Plague. The manpower was gone. Maybe Commodus, looking at the ledgers and the body count, realized that trying to permanently extend the Roman borders into the dense, hostile forests of Central Europe was a logistical nightmare and a massive waste of Roman blood.
That is increasingly the modern, synthesized view of historians. Commodus's peace treaty wasn't a cowardly betrayal of his father's legacy. It was a sobering recognition of geopolitical reality.
Yeah.
The Roman Empire had finally reached its natural logistical limits. They could punish the tribes, as seen on the column, but they could not absorb them.
Okay, so we have the end of the war in 180 AD. We have the column finished by 193 AD. But going back to the mystery at the heart of our deep dive, how does Kovacs use this grand synthesis to finally date the rain and lightning miracles?
It comes down to a clash of logic between the written text and the carved stone. Remember Cephalius, the Byzantine monk who summarized Cassius Dio?
Yes, the one who messed up the summary.
He claimed the miracle happened during the 7th imperial acclamation in the year 174 AD.
Right.
But look at the physical layout of the column. The miracles are depicted very early in its visual sequence. Out of 116 total scenes that spiral up the monument, the lightning miracle is scene 11, and the rain miracle is scene 16. They are right at the bottom.
I see the problem. If the column is depicting a war that started around 169 or 170 AD, you logically cannot have an event from 174 AD appearing as the 11th scene out of 116. The math doesn't work. The column is a chronological narrative. Someone has to be wrong.
Exactly. The internal structural logic of the column violently clashes with the written text. Kovacs deduces that the carvings on the column strictly depict the events of the First Marcomannic War, starting roughly around 170 or 171 AD.
Okay.
Because the miracles appear so early in the visual timeline of the campaign,
Huh?
they absolutely could not have happened as late as 174 AD.
So the stone cricks the scroll. Kovacs concludes that the miracles must have actually taken place much earlier, likely in 171 or perhaps early 172 AD.
Precisely. Xyvolenus, the Byzantine monk summarizing the history centuries later, simply messed up. He collapsed the timeline. He saw the exciting story of the miracles in the original text, and he lazily linked them to the official, easily verifiable record of Marcus's 7th imperial acclamation in 174 AD to tidy up his summary.
Wow.
And because later historians relied solely on these written texts for centuries, they repeated the monk's error over and over again.
It is absolute top-tier historical detective work, and it is so deeply satisfying to see how these puzzle pieces finally snap together. So what does this all mean?
It means that the written word alone, even when treated as gospel by generations of scholars, is incredibly vulnerable to bias, religious propaganda, political agendas, and simple human error.
It's just people writing things down after all.
Exactly. The true timeline of the Marcomannic Wars only makes sense when the stones are allowed to correct the scrolls. It only works when we let the physical reality of a 100-foot marble column override the ideological bickering of Christian apologists, pagan historians, and careless medieval monks.
To recap our epic journey today, we started with the terrified Roman society, facing an unprecedented invasion of Italy and bleeding out from a devastating plague. We saw Marcus Aurelius, a man who just wanted to read philosophy, forced into the freezing mud of Pannonia. We witnessed desperate, thirsty soldiers saved from annihilation by anomalous lightning and a localized rainstorm.
We waded through the fierce, centuries-long propaganda wars, separating the theological claims of the Legia 12 Fulminata from the magical spells of Egyptian sorcerers and cleverly forged documents.
We climbed the spiral carvings of the column of Marcus Aurelius, witnessing the dark, gritty reality of a traumatized empire taking brutal visual revenge to soothe its own psychological terror. And finally, we saw how modern historical synthesis untangles the knot, proving that the miracles happened years earlier than the history books claimed.
It really highlights how history isn't just a ledger of what happened. It's a constantly shifting narrative of how what happened was used by the people who survived. Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to consider.
Lay it on us.
Think about the actual men standing in that valley. The men of the Legia of the 12 Fulminata, or whatever legions were present that day. The Christian narrative claimed them as their own, transforming their survival into a theological weapon to demand political rights. The pagan narrative completely ignored them, preferring to credit exotic magicians or the emperor's personal piety to maintain the status quo of the state religion. But what was actually going through the minds of those specific, exhausted, terrified soldiers standing in the mud when the rain finally fell? We have spent 2,000 years arguing over the narrative of the miracle, dissecting coins and columns and monk summaries. But the actual lived experience of those frontline soldiers, the sheer, profound human relief of taking a breath, tasting cold water, and realizing you aren't going to die today, is something neither propaganda machine cared to accurately record.
They didn't care about the people.
No, they were just pawns in a rhetorical game played by intellectuals in Rome. It makes you wonder. If you look at the news today, what other profound, raw human moments are currently being rewritten into ideological talking points right in front of us?
Wow, that's heavy, and it is incredibly relevant. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, why do we care about a weather anomaly from 2,000 years ago? That right there is the answer. It's not about the weather. It's about how the institutions you trust build their foundational myths. We all want history to be a clean X-ray, a jagged white line showing exactly what broke, when it broke, and who fixed it. But the reality is that the diagnostic machine of history is incredibly murky. It is clouded by the egos of the people who build the monuments and the agendas of the people who write the scrolls. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, stay intensely curious, and always look beneath the surface of the stories we are told. Until next time.